would not be possible without the generous support of the numerous organizations and individuals who've already donated and are acknowledged on the back cover of the festival guide, so be sure to check that out. All right, and now the really, really great stuff. So today's program is called Are Your Monuments Worthy? And joining us today, I'm sorry, I'm just flipping through this little book here, trying to find everything. There we go. So Raffi Andonian, and again, I hope I'm saying that correctly. Alrighty, known as the celebrity historian due to his frequent appearances on TV stations nationwide, is the author of 3 history books and the producer and host of an Apple TV show connecting past and present. He regularly leads a course on contested histories and memory, and he has spoken at Oxford, Cambridge, and several humanities councils across the United States. Andonian also leads the Harmonizer Workforce Program, combining history events and employee development. So very interesting stuff, and I'll turn it over to you. Thank you for being here.
Of course, thank you. Oh. You can't do the introduction and not have a magnet, so you got to get one too. Yeah, you can't be left out. Hey, y'all. So look, we have a small group, so feel free to interrupt me along the way. I got photos, not really a lot of words, so I'm not really scripted in that regard. I know my stuff, I can pivot, dive deeper in some areas, skim over other areas, depending on what you want. That's kind of a nice thing about a small group, okay? Start with a story. I was standing on the porch of the Martin Luther King home that you see there in Atlanta. I used to work there giving tours of the home in the historic neighborhood where he grew up. And this is in 2010. There was a group of kids, aged from about 10 to 13, about preteen, that I was taking into the home, about to walk inside, and their chaperone, of course. And I noticed that one of them had scars on his face, another one had his skull kind of caved in, others had lashing marks on their body. And as we were walking in, the chaperone revealed to me that these kids were slaves from the illegal human trafficking trade, having escaped from Haiti. In 2010, these kids, that means they're born around the year 2000. And here I was meeting real-life slaves, which was really fascinating. Of course, there were different sites like Gettysburg, the Civil War. And it showed me the power of a historic site, a place like that home. Because these kids, they had recently gotten to the U.S., as the chaperone revealed, and this is one of the stops that they requested early on. Now, what does that tell you about the legacy and the impact and the sense of place? Decades after MLK, of course, was killed, and in a country that they had never been to before. That, to me, is the singular moment of the power of place. So when I think about the controversies that happen around historic sites and monuments, historic symbols, curricula, you know, these are the issues that I think kind of, I think monuments are manifestations of where these issues clash, but there is a broader view to look at. And I'm going to take a race through some of these and present to you some questions when you're asking, are your monuments worthy? Hence I say take the quiz, a little quiz guidance, if you will. First question is, why remember? To me, that is a question of significance. And that's me on TV in New Mexico recently talking about the film Oppenheimer and its accuracies, or level of accuracy. And this is, of course, the atomic bomb. This is specifically a photo from the Library of Congress of the bombing at Nagasaki, the second of the 2 bombs used by the United States in Japan to help end World War II. Talk about a powerful symbol, right? And that's the actual photo of the actual bomb, not a test or anything like that. Now, before I cover the question, here's a little trivia question I'm curious for y'all. What is that photo? I got that from Los Alamos archives. Now, you may not know that exact photo, but that thing is depicted in the movie Oppenheimer if you saw it, and they refer specifically to the name. It's not Fat Man. So Fat Man and Little Boy were the bombs that were dropped. This was when it was still, Los Alamos was still a secret city, so they had to kind of keep things in code. What was the code word for that bomb? The gadget. If you remember in the movie, they're going to refer to it as gadget. So if word got out, it would help, reduce the information that's getting out. But I'll tell you what, since you tried, I'll give you one of my books. How about that? We're at a book festival, so I got you, right? But why remember to me is a question of significance. When you look at that bomb, you may have different reactions. You may think that it's helped save your ancestor's life because maybe your ancestor was someone that might have gone to Japan had they not used the bomb. Or maybe you may think it represents a lot of terrible things that happened during or ever since. But certainly what we don't question is the significance. I think that's part of the reason that we fight over it. Certainly shaped geopolitics for decades to come, and still does. Look at what's going on in Russia, Ukraine, and we always consider the question of the nuclear question. But also beyond that, it's not all kind of this, destruction. For example, nuclear medicine is something that has advanced medicine quite a bit. So these things are mixed. Or how about nuclear energy, which has itself the pluses and minuses. The pluses of being very clean and intense, but the minuses of the nuclear waste. So to me, the why remember sort of transcends that question and first says, well, let's establish first about measuring the significance and the impact and the influence. The second question is, what is a history being remembered? So this is kind of where you try to get some factual information in, because I think sometimes we depart from that. A couple quick examples from a variety of contexts is on the lower left there, you see petroglyphs, which are all over North America, but in that case in New Mexico. And these are, of course, artwork on the rock. There's different kinds of rock art, but it's a form of rock art that's left there by indigenous peoples, largely, although some generations since have added also. But these are across centuries, different peoples, different cultures. And I think sometimes what happens is we read into it what we want to read into it. And this happens very frequently in historical symbols and monuments, and in this case, the artwork. Because it's very easy to project what you believe onto peoples that you don't know from centuries ago, who also themselves changed over time. What someone wrote 3,000 years ago is not the same as what someone wrote 500 years ago. They're different peoples. And you see that a lot in the petroglyph world. How about in the upper right? The gas prices. I remember recently, about a year and a half ago, there was this conversation of, hey, gas prices are going up. It's just like the 1970s. No, it's not. Actually, if you look at the context of the 1970s, some of the economic conditions and the law and the regulations were different, such that it was not a repeat of the 1970s. And of course, with Russia, Ukraine right now, there's a contest of whose history is correct. For example, Ukraine claims independence, and Russia claims Ukraine and really the steppe region as its ancestral origin. This goes beyond the Soviet Union. It is not a Soviet Union thing. I think it's more going back 1,000 years to Kievan Rus, where Russians identify ethnic origin from that region. It goes far beyond the Soviet Union, which is a confederation of states. This is saying, you're one of us. So understanding what is the history being remembered is going to then help shape how we commemorate it. So let's keep some of these examples in mind, because we'll come back around. Question number 3, what does it mean to remember? So this is telling you, are we celebrating? Are we commemorating? Are we condemning? Are we condoning? So for example, in the case of this monument here, that's of course the monument to Robert E. Lee, a Monument Avenue in Virginia, in Richmond, Virginia, the former Confederate capital, where I briefly lived and worked. And I put that there because that got nationwide attention. Of course, it got all kinds of graffiti, artwork, whatever you want to call it, protest stuff on there. And then eventually came down. This is a Confederate White House, so let's focus on those two for a moment because they're very close to each other. That's in Richmond also. It's a big difference between monuments and historic sites. For example, the Confederate White House is a historic site. There's only one of it. You don't have 100 Confederate White Houses across the country. There's only one. It's the place, the singular place, where those particular events related to the White House took place. The monument, on the other hand, while it might be a particular version of a Lee monument, you got tons of those things all over the country, right? And they're not necessarily on a historic site, and they're always a depiction by an artist, right? That's who's putting up the Lee monument. So you have a commission, you can have an organization, usually some sort of memorial group, so that's already going to be one particular group. Then they're going to hire an artist from different applicants, let's say, and an artist is going to do a particular depiction. It could be positive, it could be negative, depends on what we're talking about here, right? And Of course, that changes the whole context. A lot of times when you go to the dedication ceremony, if you look at the documents of the dedication ceremony, you kind of find out what they're trying to do with this, more so than simply projecting. So we got to try to see, what does it mean to remember? So remember, a historic site is a singular place where something occurs. So what I talk about in the book, for example, in the case study, is looking at the Manhattan Project National Historical Park, which is now in existence, but at the time, about 10, 12 years ago, when it was going through Congress, had debate such that it got killed in Congress, in part because there was this notion of, are we glorifying the atomic bomb by creating a national park to it? But I would say that the site is a different thing than, say, putting up a monument to the bomb anywhere else. There's only one of the sites. So the important thing that I say is that we got to distinguish historic sites and monuments, and then within that ask the question of, what does it mean to remember? Now sometimes it's really benign. So I think sometimes we read into things, sometimes we don't read them into enough, and sometimes we read too much. This is me as an intern taking a goofy photo in front of a monument on the Gettysburg battlefield because some of the men who fought in that unit went to the same college I did. And that's me with my fellow college students, or alum at that point, or whatever we were at, I don't remember. But that connection, what does it mean to remember, is me just remembering my school. Okay, so we got to be careful how we think about these things. So what I'm trying to get at is these stories are complex. So I went on, and with these 4 questions and with these monument stuff was going on in 2020, that's how I first got on TV. And one of the segments won an Emmy, which is pretty cool. So it goes to show you that, you know, when you're out there trying to be not polarized, sometimes it can pay off. Now here's the hardest and the longest time what we'll spend on is how to remember. So this is, how do we tell the stories? So let's go through the first 3 real quick to set this up, because this is really where we're going to focus. This is the hardest part. First, we establish significance with why remember. Second, what is the history to be remembered? So we're trying to find out what happened before we kind of assume based on our interpretations. Number 3, what does it mean to remember? So what are we actually doing here? Let's kind of look at, is this glorifying or not, condemning, whatever we're doing. Context is what I would say. But now that we've established that, how to remember? How do we tell these stories at these sites, or even at these monuments? Maybe it's some signage or a tour, it's incorporated in a tour. However it is, however the community decides to do it. So I choose a very powerful historic symbol to help you all see this. So how about the Martin Luther King, excuse me, I was looking at this and I said Martin Luther King. I forgot to pass this around, I realized, but we can get back to it if you like. But this is a medallion from the U.S. Mint that has MLK on it that was put out. It's bronze medal. Kind of cool, you know, so I thought I'd circulate that, because that is a way of remembering as well. That's one of the ways you can tell the stories. And we're going to get to some coins in a moment. But the Confederate flag, come back here for a second, how to remember. On the left, you have it clearly, obviously being used by the Klan, right? So not a very positive use, let's say. On the right, you have a more benign use. This is a water park in Florida. And what they're doing is just using it as a symbol, as entertainment. There are many times this symbol was used in entertainment. You could go to a Spanish soccer game sometimes and see it. You know, I just saw that recently, so it came to mind. You know, it can be used as a symbol of rebellion or independence. Remember, on the front of trucks for a long time. You're seeing less and less of this, but I think especially after 2015 with the shootings of the black church with the guy, was it something Roof? I forgot his first name. I think that made it less socially acceptable. But again, it is one of those things where it has changed across time. So in the early years after the war, it was used solely as an artifact of war, not as a political symbol. Then as generations passed, it started to pop up as a political symbol, including with the Klan. And then it starts to become this symbol that sometimes is regional identity, sometimes is martial, like you would have soldiers sometimes use it, U.S. soldiers in World War I, World War II, and you would even have it, of course, in college football, for example. So what I mean by how to remember is, how do you tell the stories of the many layers of generations of meanings behind this flag? What you see in the color photo there is I tried to do that in the context with the National Park Service when I worked at Gettysburg doing an evening lecture program going across generations of this meaning. So one of the ways to answer that question, perhaps, is understanding change over time, the many uses of the flag. So you see that any particular use isn't always the way it has been used or not used. Staying on the battlefield, how about this right here? Living history, as we call it. It's not the same thing as reenactment. Look in the upper left, firing the guns on the battlefield. Reenactment is much larger scale than 50 guys or whatever is up there. And you fire at each other, or you pretend to fire at each other, and there's really no script, and generally it's not accurate, and it's a commercial venture, and it's generally not on site. For example, we never did one at the Gettysburg battlefield, although you will see a Gettysburg reenactment. That's at a farm off-site, because we can't have thousands of people trampling all over the place and destroying the resource. Living history is small scale, where you take a small group and say, we're going to do this for an educational purpose. We're not going to be firing at each other playing war, but we're going to be demonstrating what, for example, the smoke and sound is like. Because if you see that, you might say, man, I can't see the guys in there. And if I could multiply that thousands of times with the actual battle, I could understand why some of these guys were completely lost on the battlefield. Or they can't hear their orders, because I can't hear myself think, and there's 50 guns there. These guys had 100,000 around them. You see what I'm saying? So that's one of the ways you can tell the story. Now, I've never done living history myself, but the closest I came as a fun little story is they made us put on wool uniforms when I first got to Gettysburg and do a day of hiking around the battlefield, or half a day, and camping out at night. Now, if you go there as a visitor, you can't camp out, but I got to do it just because it was my first year there. Now, I didn't march 30 miles and have to go into battle, so I can't say I experienced exactly what the soldiers did, but I experienced a little bit of the warm summer in wool, marching around and having to sleep on the ground at the battlefield, and it does give you a taste. So in this case, what we're talking about, how to remember, is maybe experiences, right? How about how to remember immediately after the battle? You have Abraham Lincoln, who came in the months after the Battle of Gettysburg and delivered the Gettysburg Address. What you see in the upper left there is some of the graves, some of the cemetery that was established shortly after the battle. And of course, the Gettysburg Address talking about a new birth of freedom from right here in this battlefield, which has transcended and gone across many wars for many soldiers, many kind of rallying cries. And that Pennsylvania monument you see there on the right, very reflective. It's a very different type of monument than some of the other ones that we've been looking at, right? This is much more reflective. There are monuments in the National Cemetery, too. In fact, I got this pen from my time at Gettysburg, made of the wood of a witness tree, meaning the tree witnessed the Gettysburg Address, was next to Lincoln, from 1863. Now, I didn't chop down the tree. There's only a few in the whole battlefield. Actually, this one's gone now. But lightning hit it, and there was a limb that was salvageable. And because I worked there, I got one of the rangers to make a couple hundred pens, and we ended up getting pens. So I have a couple of these. But this is a great example of tangible to the intangible. This is a tangible thing, right? It's a tangible thing that I'm holding, touching, it's in front of me. Connects to the intangible of what happened there on those days, during those months. Staying on the battlefield, let's go talk about some different ways of how to remember. Here's where things get challenging, and I'm going to get into some weird complications here after we establish some of the framework. On the right side, those two monuments are on the actual battlefield. So I was just telling you that monuments are generally off-site. They don't necessarily depict what happened. They're made by an artist, but here we are on the historic site, and there's monuments. Boy, that's a challenge. How do you handle those? That's why there's no clean answer here, guys. It's not the same thing every time. So these monuments were put up by the men themselves, which makes it even more complicated. These are the veterans. They came back a generation later, wanted to commemorate the decisive Union victory that finally showed that General Lee's army can be defeated, that they're not invincible. That made sure that Lee's army never came north again after he had tried twice. So of course the veterans are going to want to come back and commemorate that. A lot of times not exactly entirely accurately. For example, the veterans are going to get into infighting. Well, my unit did more than your unit, and my monument's going to show that. So you see, monuments and history are not always the same thing, right? Well, in this case, I kind of thought it was cool, though, because now we get to talk about the memory of the war, right? That the veterans came back and commemorated, had the fighting amongst each other. the bickering, the rivalries, some more intense than others. Now the monument becomes part of the history. It's a little bit different context. Over here in the upper left is the Bryan Farm. That is a free black family that was living in southern Pennsylvania at the time, just a few miles from the Mason-Dixon line from Maryland. So Maryland was a slave state, Pennsylvania was a free state, but Gettysburg is like 8 miles north of the border. So they lived right near slavery, but not in it. And so they were concerned when Lee's army came up that they may be captured and essentially put into slavery, because that did happen. There are accounts of that. Because, there was this assigning of status based on skin color, especially in the slave states, so you would kind of assume that someone who has black skin is a slave. So if you're an invading army, you could capture them and, of course, entrap them into slavery. So they're worried about that, so they got out of there before the battle because they realized what's happening. So they did make it, although their farm was very much destroyed because of the battle that took place on their property, among other properties, of course. But they did make it, and they didn't get captured. So there's a great example of how to remember, how to tell the story of, in this case, sort of some of the causes of the war, right? We're talking about slavery and, and of course, its association with civil war. And you're doing it right there with a tangible resource. Now let's get into some perspectives. We're talking about some of the complexity we're getting into. In Los Alamos, where I used to work also, where the atomic bomb was created, and that book is about, which story do you tell? The one on the left, with the destruction in Japan, or the one on the right, with the exhilaration of victory? Both are true, both are real. Both have real people experiencing them. So these are one of the challenges when you're at a historic site that has a complex legacy. How do you handle telling these stories? How do you tell both and more stories that are associated with the historic site? And how do you do so? By holding your audience who's going to have different opinions, different perspectives. Here's another way, sticking in Los Alamos. How about a historic building that is still used to this day? So take a look in the upper left. That's a building that is a community, well, it's used, it was actually originally built for the ranch school, which the movie depicts briefly. They kind of mention it, they don't depict it. And the ranch school had a bunch of buildings up there that when the Manhattan Project came into town for the atomic bomb, they built upon. That was the initial infrastructure, and then they built upon that. Of course, they kicked out the ranch school. And, well, let me tell you this. If you've seen the movie Oppenheimer, do you remember what that building was called? Or if I'll make it easier. Give me a scene in which it was depicted, because there was a couple times that log building is depicted. Do you remember a scene? You can't miss it. I know you see. If you saw the movie, like there's no way you missed it. Give me a guess. Obviously, it was not when they dropped the bomb, because they didn't drop it there. You didn't do the homework? It's okay. Do you want to take a guess? That's a few hundred miles south, so not quite. Not quite. But it's actually, so this is in Los Alamos. Here, I'll give you a Los Alamos history sticker. How about that? Especially because you introduced me. So this is from the History Museum, from my time there. Limited edition, so see, I only have so many of those. So, yeah. So that's called the Fuller Lodge, and the scenes in which you see it are, for example, after the announcement of the bomb being dropped in Japan and the victory. That's right, the applause and the speech, and Oppenheimer is having these kind of visions. There's a couple other places too, but that's a big one where they really show it. Now today, it's used at a community center. What you're seeing there is some sort of gathering. It could be a job fair. There are weddings there, dances, lectures. My organization did lectures there. You name it. I mean, like, it's anything community. It is actually a county building, and is used by the community for community gathering. And when I worked at the organization, we actually rented a couple of rooms upstairs, and then a wing that it has, actually more than a couple of rooms, for an office. So I got to work in that building, which is kind of cool. But it doesn't always have to be behind a red rope, right? It doesn't always have to be a museum. Sometimes what happens is that you are able to continue to keep its tradition of a gathering place. It was dining hall during the Rand School days, so the boys would get together there, eat and exchange, conversation. In the Manhattan Project, you saw some examples of how it was used. It was used in many ways, but one of the ways, community uses, I should say. And then there we are today, using it as such. So it doesn't always have to be this binary of tear it down or put it in a sealed envelope. It can be this living thing that the community gets to continue to engage with its identity. And that is very much a central identity building in that community still to this day. In part because everyone's been there for one reason or another. You know someone that got married there, you went to a lecture there, you went there for a job. You just went there for different reasons. So sticking in that theme of stuff today, recently, in the last few months, I got to go to what's called a Descendants Day. These are descendants of the enslaved populations of some of the plantations in Virginia. In this case, the presidents that are from there. We're talking about Thomas Jefferson, James Monroe, and James Madison. Now, of course, there are more presidents from Virginia, but in this case, that's what we were talking about. Those three are practically neighbors. They're all from the same very small area of Virginia. Really fascinating. We got three presidents in a row from the same neighborhood, let's call it almost, But what you're seeing here is we were doing a documentary. We took the trip to do some other stuff. This is me with the direct descendant of Sally Hemings' brother. So Sally Hemings, you may have heard of, because 25 years ago there was that DNA testing that showed that Thomas Jefferson very likely fathered kids with Sally Hemings. This is her brother's direct descendant, so directly from the Monticello family. This lady here is from the enslaved folks of the James Monroe plantation, not directly of Monroe himself, but of the people that were enslaved on that plantation. What I think is fascinating when we're talking about how to remember, look, we're eating food. It was like a giant family reunion. It was 100 people or so. They came from all over the country, because of course people are scattered all over the place. It was a fascinating feeling, and I'm going to give you a sample of that feeling. This is from my Instagram post. I stole it and put it on here. So let's see how it works. Pretty cool. So you want to talk about people connecting with history and the question of how to remember, that's another way. Pretty powerful. Oops. Now, speaking of connecting with food, how about some of this? Y'all ever done a recipe from your grandma or something like that to help remind you? Family heritage. We do this stuff all the time. It doesn't always have to be on a big national scale. It can be very micro, neighborhood, all the way up to, all kinds of scale and size. So I'm going to give you a couple cool examples that we did, because I want you to see sort of how to remember stuff, how it continues. Sorry, I keep doing that. Did a TV segment. Are you following George Washington's rules for civility on the 4th of July? So I took some rules for civility that he created. It was based on historical things that he created them. He didn't create them out of nowhere. And I showed what not to do with 4th of July props, so hot dogs and beer. And I said, no, here's what you shouldn't do. It's trying to demonstrate and teach history. How about here, speaking of George Washington? This is what they served in his house on Christmas. It's called Christmas pie. Not unique to him. It's very much an English dish, but it is one of his favorites. There's a lot of records for it. It's kind of like a chicken pot pie. Here we are talking about the Whiskey Rebellion. I thought I'd incorporate some whiskey, because why not? Let's have some whiskey on air, on live TV. All this stuff is live. So live morning TV. I poured the whiskey. I didn't know if the anchor was going to participate or not. The guy decided to participate, and I was like, all right, well, if he's going to take a shot, I'm going to take a shot. So here we are. But these are fun ways, right? We're engaging. Food, engagement, interaction. How about over here? Y'all might have heard of George Washington Carver. He's the Peanut Man. Born in Missouri, spent most of his career in Tuskegee, and he put out hundreds of ways to use peanuts, peanut butter, all kinds of things. One of the ways he promoted was shaving. So I tried it on live TV. So let's see if this works. It's the first time I ever did it. I just did it, it was spontaneous. I didn't know how it was going to work, or I was thought. But again, interacting with these things, right? So when we talk about how to remember, again, it's not just the exhibits. It's not just the monuments, but this is actual family stuff like we saw on the prior slide. It can be food and drink, and it can be even entertaining. So along those lines, let's talk about this quarters. Because this stuff is in our pockets. You may not realize it, but there's something called the American Women Quarters Program from the United States Mint. Now, money is where nations honor their heroes. Been doing that for millennia. We have George Washington on the head side of the quarter. And now on the tail side, we have a series of historic women that are being honored. From 2022 to 2025. 5 a year for 4 years, so 20 total. And I've been keeping track of these, doing presentations on each one as it comes out. And this one is Edith Kanakaole. She was an indigenous Hawaiian. And she was alive in the, mostly, pretty much her life was the 20th century. She died in the 1980s, I want to say. And in the process of Hawaii becoming a state, she wanted to make sure that indigenous lands were not going to disappear, because there was a lot of pressure from the federal government, development especially. She wanted to make sure indigenous culture and language would not disappear, because again, with tourism and assimilation, there was a lot of pressure. And she was one of the women that was honored here. Now, the reason I point this out for us today, because to me it shows you that there's two sides to the coin. That you don't have to have one or the other. And really, I think there's more than two sides, but a quarter only has two faces, so we got to deal with two. So we'll stick with two. But the point is that there isn't just one. You can have George Washington, like I did on the previous stuff, and you can have a lady like Edith on here and the story she has to tell. And I actually think in the story, they both need each other to complete. Without George Washington's promise, I mean, it's the country's promise, but him being a part of this, you don't have some of the possibilities that later came up, including Edith's efforts. But on the other hand, without places where the story of George Washington falls short, right? You need women like Edith Kanakaole to come up and continue to help complete the picture and deliver on the promise made by Washington and his peers. In other words, the story needs each other. I'm going to pass this around for you guys to handle it. These are actual quarters. They're just not used. That's why they're so shiny. And you'll see our friend Edith Kanakaole in the upper right. And you'll see the others. This is the 2023 edition. So this is the current edition. You can go get it if you want it. You can go get it on usmint.gov. I don't get a commission. I'm not affiliated. Just go check it out. So if you don't find it in your pocket, or you go to the bank, or do something like that, if you want it like that, the pretty one that I like to put on TV that you're seeing right there, you can go get it on usmint.gov. It's nothing. It's like $30, $40. Now, you only have $1.25 quarters in there, but you are getting a cool artifact. So with that, let's tell the story of George Wythe, one of my favorite historic figures, as we begin to kind of land this plane here. Because we looked at all kinds of ways of how to tell the story. So let's look at George Wythe, one of my favorite. I've been talking about putting a little tattoo of his signature on my forearm, and you wouldn't see it, but it kind of reminds me of checking myself too. And here's what I mean by that. George Wythe is in the center there, and I'm at his home, George Wythe home in Williamsburg, Virginia, in that photo on the left. See, I live this stuff. That's why I include this stuff. I want you to see that I'm doing the stuff we're talking about. It's not just theoretical, and weave in some of the stories. And he was a professor at William & Mary and was tutoring both Thomas Jefferson, which you see in the upper right, and John Marshall, who you see in the the lower right. Jefferson, of course, went on to be the third president of the United States, among other achievements. John Marshall went on to be the first major Chief Justice of the Supreme Court that really shaped the court's role. He wasn't technically the first, but the first one we remember in terms of shaping the identity of the court. And these guys were nasty rivals. They hated each other. And yet they had the same tutor. Blows me away. And they respected George Wythe so much. Now Marshall did not sign the Declaration. Well, of course, Jefferson did. He wrote it, and he signed it. And, of course, several other Virginians did. That they left the top line of the Virginia section open for George Wythe to sign because they wanted him to be on top, even though he was not the first one that signed of the Virginia delegation. That's how much they respected Wythe. Contrary to popular perception, there was not that big room that we all think of the signing. That did not happen. It was over the course of weeks that it was signed. After they voted on independence on July 2nd, people went home. And then when the Declaration was released, it was signed sort of over the course of subsequent weeks. So that's how Wythe had that space on top. But my point is, how is it that two rivals, both smart people, have the same teacher? And what that tells me is that when we're out there learning, teaching, considering these things, that it's not just about I have to inculcate you with what I believe, but I can be like George Wythe in giving you the tools to go make your own sort of research and conclusions and thinking, even be rivals and both be smart and both be valid. That to me is always a reminder of how you can teach well and not be indoctrinating. Finally, nothing else to me captures everything we're talking about like Mount Rushmore. Because you tell me if this is a historic site or a monument, because I have a hard time, and I'm not sure it fits in to either one, and that's the beauty of it, because the stuff isn't an either or. It could be multiple things in different contexts. It's a traditional cultural site, of course, for the indigenous peoples, but from a perspective of the folks who made the monument, it's not a particularly notable historic site. It's really more a monument when it's being done, right? As a monument to these figures. But now, the monument is so transcendent that it is kind of a historic site as a monument. Possibly, certainly one of the most recognized monuments in the country. Maybe Washington Monument and this, I don't know. There's maybe a couple of them, right? I follow basketball. A lot of times there's this question of who's on your Mount Rushmore? Is LeBron James on the Mount Rushmore, or is it just, Wilt Chamberlain and Jordan and Magic and Bird? Like this is a pop cultural reference now, right? So you can argue that it's both a monument and a historic site. Of course, we can get to questions of who's depicted and why, how they're depicted. Those are a whole series of other questions, but we have a hard time even classifying, I think, as a monument or a historic site. So I love Mount Rushmore in that regard, because if you want to have a good discussion, this is a really good one, and I don't think any one person, any one answer is right, much like Jefferson and Marshall. They both had great points. This is really cool. This is what it looked like before. This is the model it was based on, of course, what it became, and then sort of the grandeur of it here. So that's me. You can check me out if you like. You can go on YouTube, where I post my videos from all over the country when I'm going on TV. I put my little 5-minute TV clips on there. It's always ABC, CBS, NBC, and Fox. So I make sure I'm communicating to non-historian audiences, so we can make sure that we're getting this out beyond just our own circles. Or if you're on Instagram, you can follow me on there. You go on the website, poke around, check out all kinds of just free content that's out there. Because what I'm always trying to do is try to help people see multiple angles and perspectives that are informed by research, that are based in factual information, but can still have these valid interpretations the way that we talked about, and go through that process. All right? Thank you all very much. I'll take some questions. Yeah. Go ahead. In the history or TV or which of it? So I worked at Gettysburg, right? You saw that. So I grew up in L.A. I read about Jefferson as a kid in my textbook or something, and I was like, oh, I want to go to the East Coast and see this stuff. So a couple years later, I was lucky that my family went to the East Coast, to Philly, saw Independence Hall, and that made history come alive for me. Talk about historic sites coming alive. That's the story of, to me, making history come alive, right? The MLK was me as an adult, but that was me as a kid. And you know how it is when you're a kid, you have sort of these heroes, right? As you grow up, you kind of, things adjust a little, you see more complexity. But some of my heroes were Jefferson, Frederick Douglass, Abe Lincoln, and some others. And so, as much as I talk about George Washington, he was never actually a hero of mine. I mean, he's fine, but the point is that set me on a path. So I always wanted to move to the East. So I moved to Pennsylvania in college. I got to Gettysburg. I got an internship at Gettysburg that became a job in the summers as I went through graduate school. And then I worked at Martin Luther King Home in Richmond, as you saw. Then when I finished graduate school, I worked at Los Alamos, where the atomic bomb was created. That's when I finished a thesis, actually. The book came out, and I began to do fundraising, because one of my degrees was actually in fundraising. So I did programming and fundraising, helped with the fundraising there. And because I realized by a variety of nonprofits I watched, especially at Gettysburg, even though I worked for the National Park Service there, that you have to raise money to achieve these things. So I diversified my skills, and that was a big key, because that was what set me down the path, the roundabout way of understanding money and economics and marketing. And that's part of the reason that I'm able to market myself so well on a quote-unquote boring topic, right? So eventually what happened is I always stayed involved in boards and volunteering and all kinds of stuff. But eventually I put the thesis out as a book, and I have a couple other books, but this is one that was the first one, that was a big one. And those 4 questions in 2020, the opportunity came for me to present those 4 questions, because I understood marketing and I took some training on how to get on TV. I didn't hire a publicist. I still don't have a publicist for TV, because honestly they're not as good at me at getting on TV, and I can prove that because they can't promise me as many appearances as I get by myself, so I don't hire them. So I know exactly the hooks they want and what the producers want, and I find relevant historical hooks to get on. And as I got on TV, I've been on more than 100 times on ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox stations. There's no other historian going on ABC, CBS, NBC, Fox regularly, because I try intentionally not to communicate only to the history folks. So I did it maybe 6 to 8 times a month. As that happened, other things came. So some speaking gigs came. I created a Harmonizer Workforce program based on my background of understanding business and history. Harmonizer Workforce uses history to do all live events to engage employees, both virtual and in person, engage employees for better interpersonal understanding. You can kind of tell I have that angle from what I'm talking about here. And better leadership skills, so better decision making, because I cover some of that too, and I do a series of cool events for that. So really I would say that it's a morphing of things, starting from historic sites. Oddly enough, lucky enough that I worked at these huge historic sites that have these huge questions, and then just trying to be creative with it and building on those, both in the research side and reading, but also taking it to media. I do like being on camera, I'm not going to lie. I love being on stage. So I took the elements I like to do that and to get impact beyond our circles. One of the things I always got frustrated was we would do these lectures at historical societies and things like that, which are valuable, don't get me wrong, but then you have like the same circle of people in there all the time. So how do we get out beyond that? And TV is a helpful way. I don't even own a TV. But it doesn't mean that TV isn't powerful, because when you see that as a portfolio, which I've gotten a lot of things from that, just as that as a portfolio, it shows how I am, how I approach things, etc. As seen on TV is something that is marketable, and that's what matters, even if you've never seen me live. So to me, that was one of the big hooks. And like I said, the speaking stuff, the harmonized workforce. I've done consulting on a movie. I was at that documentary thing, which is separate from the movie. So from there, it just kind of evolved. So I went on my own. I am about to do an adjunct position at a local college in St. Louis, an HBCU named Harris Stowe, but limited because I want to be able to keep doing what I'm doing with the flexibility of my schedule. But I do like teaching as well. So my undergrad was in history, and believe it or not, I have 4 master's degrees. One in history, one in historic preservation, which is not history. That was with the College of Environment and Design. So that's understanding architecture, urban planning, even the Main Street development, nothing to do with history. And then 3 was nonprofit development and fundraising, and 4 was an MBA with a concentration in economics and marketing. I would say you got to attach 2 things. You take one of the old school fundamentals, like a history or whatever it is, like one of the truly academic topics, and then you, I think, complement that with what we would call in today's vocational world an applied skill. In my case, it was fundraising that then took me down that path. It could be something else for someone else. Because that's what you can then market, because I totally think that history is a great way to have great skills, like writing, critical thinking, all kinds of things, right? I mean, some people can't even write an email. And I'm not talking about formatting, I'm talking about just grammar, okay? Just communicate clearly, right? So just that is, and do you think that's not valuable in the workplace? Of course it is, right? So I totally think that, but the problem is that unless you're going out on your own, the employer doesn't immediately see that when they see that on the resume. So you got to have something else to show them that you have other skills to get in the door and then excel because of those things, right? Even if you're not working at a historic site. Or if you are working at a historic site, you're going to think that a history degree is great. The problem is there's others who have history degrees too. So what are you doing to be applicable there? Nonprofits need you to wear multiple hats. So be able to wear multiple hats. Then the fundraising money, people love money. You come in there and you say, I can raise money, that helps, right? Yeah. Oh, man. This is a tricky thing. So I'm always hesitant when we're talking about legal action because I'm not sure if that helps the situation. I understand also, though, where that's coming from. And you can argue that, there's this sort of degrees thing. That's so extreme on one degree that maybe that's one of those exceptions to the rule. I'm open to that argument. But on the other hand, I also worry a little bit about, I can tell you this from experience in the Civil War stuff. You can risk fueling that you're trying to stamp us out, and that can actually make things worse. And I think sometimes when you lay it to bear, it's a little easier for it to kind of die down, if that makes any sense. And I also worry about once you do a legal thing, do you then potentially open a door to weaponize a multitude of symbols that are not as extreme? I do have some concern there. So I can kind of see both sides. Those are my thoughts. If you're asking what I think, I kind of can see that. So I need to have a discussion about that. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, right. You're right. Yeah.
Your comments about that made me wonder what you would say.
Yeah, and of course it depends on the situation, right? Like the Nazi stuff is probably unless you go way back in time, and I know the Navajo and others used it, but you're less likely since World War II to find someone using it in a benign way compared to the Confederate flag. So that is a consideration I would also have. So I don't know if I would compare the two. Even though we often do, but I'm saying for me, I'm not saying you necessarily did, but I understand the jump that you're doing. But I think that sometimes when I see out there the comparison, I'm like, well, hang on a second. There's a difference here. You may not like it, that's okay, but we do have to be articulating the differences.
Sometimes on TV or internet or whatever, some people make a short circuit connection that is obviously not as complex as we know that it really is.
Yeah, but I'm critical of that because you know what? Go on my YouTube and look at my clips, and they're 3, 4, 5 minutes long. And despite the fact that I can do the sound bites they want, I don't oversimplify it in those sound bites. So there is a way to choose your words carefully. I will allow for people slipping. You make slip of the tongue, absolutely. But I mean, as a pattern, there is a way to handle that. One of the 6 principles of interpretation that I learned is interpretation is the whole, not a part. So you got to know how to take the whole and condense it rather than just give a part. And the way you do that is you stay at a high level, but people want details. So in certain key areas, you take the detail, and then you come back up from the deep depth of those weeds, and then keep the story moving. You just have to pick which details you're going to do that. And if you notice, I did a little bit of that here. Some things I stayed higher level, because we could talk for days about stuff, and some things I said, let's go here for a moment, and we're going to come back out and keep moving. So you got to be able to do that. So I would say in that case, it's communication skills. Communication skills that they need to work on. I don't think it's an excuse. I'll give you another quick example. Movies. A lot of times you hear, oh yeah, they can't cover everything in 2 hours. Of course they can't cover everything, but you can convey the essence accurately in a couple hours. And which did that very well? Oppenheimer. I think it did a great job. There's details I would quibble with, absolutely, but the main thrust of the story, great job capturing those nuances. Most films fail to do that, so it can be done. It can be done. You just have to be very careful. What other questions? I thought I saw another arm. Did you raise your hand? Someone else? Or was I dreaming? Okay. I'll just leave you with this. I know we're over time, but since you guys are just hanging out, I might as well say something else. There's a process I go through. One of the big questions I get all the time is, how do you handle these difficult things? You know, I mean, like I was at Gettysburg talking about the Confederate flag across time. Man, like, you know, you really try and I was 20 years old when I started doing that program. Like, I was really fascinated from this from early on. I was fortunate enough to have a supervisor that was supportive of me doing that. Otherwise, you know, who knows, right? But to me, there's a three-step process that developed over time. I didn't know this when I was 20, but I kind of developed it over time because it takes an accumulation of experiences to be able to take the vastness of your thoughts and say, okay, let me kind of create a formula that I can actually communicate. And there's three steps. One, surprise perception. Two, provoke reflection. And three, inspire learning. The way you do these, I think, is through inquiry. So if I had someone in front of me one-on-one talking about something, I have a whole array of beliefs related to Civil War. And you know, you can't imagine some of the stuff I came across. If I just beat them over the head, I'm not going to get anywhere, right? So you got to ask yourself, am I being constructive? Right? You got to kind of take yourself out of this for a second and say, am I being constructive here? And then two, so if I do that, I'm gonna ask questions, understand where they're coming from, and then surprise perception in some fashion. A great example is the Confederate flag. Someone might say, I used to get this all the time, we get this much less now, but it's heritage, not hate. And you know what? I get it from that perspective. I don't like the word heritage, but that's a whole sidetrack. But I get what they're trying to say. But then, as you ask questions, and if you surprise perception, you might also show, well, part of the heritage of the flag, while it has some of the uses you're talking about, also has these other ones. I'm not saying that yours is wrong, and it's not. But the heritage changes over time. That's history. It's changed over time. And as they see that, I've done it so many times, and you'd be amazed how the entire demeanor changes. So the second part is you provoke reflection. I'm not provoking anger. I'm not provoking reaction. I'm provoking reflection, musing. That's a different place, because when someone gets surprised, that does provoke the reflection. It's a little more. I didn't realize that there's more to the story. Now you're reflective. And therefore, inspire learning. There's more to learn. I care about the flag, but now I realize that there's more to learn. And now you see the complexity. You don't have to change your opinion, because like multiple things are true here. You just have to understand that there's complexity, so when we're actually having a discussion over this, we're able to find some sort of, okay, you're not the devil over here. We're able to actually, you know, move forward in some fashion. All right, I don't want to hold you all, because I'm over time. I want to dismiss you all. Thank you guys so much. If you want to talk one-on-one afterwards, come on up and talk to me. No problem.